2014 edition of the vBrownBag US. Tonight we'll be covering VMware vCloud Hybrid Service Disaster Recovery with Chris Colotti at Colotti on Twitter. Now, before I hand over the broadcast to Chris, just a few notes to make you guys aware of. We have the Cisco certification track for all of you networking fans out there. We're going to do some deep dives into networking technology and help others who are interested in Cisco certification to get the skills they need for the CCNA and parts of the CCNP. Also, the schedule for that's posted on professionalvmware.com. We also have our vBrownBag Junior program that's going to be run by Jeremiah Dooley. And if you want to follow along with the conversations on any of our topics, but especially tonight, tweet with the hashtag vBrownBag, and you can follow all of our various vBrownBag Twitter accounts. Now, for those of you who may be interested in other topic areas or other time zones, we have the Asia Pacific vBrownBag every other Thursday, 9 p.m. New Zealand Standard Time, the EMEA vBrownBag on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, Latin America, Thursdays at 7 p.m. Pacific Time in Espanol, and the U.S., which is what you're listening to right now, every Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. Central. Again, our host is Chris Colotti, and I will be taking questions. My name is Trevor Roberts, VM Trooper, and I'll be taking questions either in the GoToMeeting window and also on the Twitter hashtag. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Chris. And let me go ahead and pass the presentation. Okay, you should be able to share your screen.
Yep, let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, I'm seeing the PowerPoint now.
All right, cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through this presentation is the official technical presentation that we give on vCloud Hybrid Service Disaster Recovery. I will go quickly through it because I think what everybody really wants to see is live demo stuff. So we'll try to get to some of the stuff in my view session. We can actually show how this is set up. So, but I want to give a baseline using the PowerPoint slides. And again, I won't dwell on a lot of this stuff. So we'll go through what a quick overview of vCloud Hybrid Service Disaster Recovery is, and just I'm going to nitpick because I've gotten, like I was telling a couple people today, I kind of get slapped myself for using the wrong terminology. We are not calling it DR as a service. It's not DR2C. It's not anything like that. The official name, the official release name is vCloud Hybrid Service Disaster Recovery. So we'll give an overview of it. We'll give you some background information on the architecture, which I think is personally pretty cool. We'll go through some quick screenshots showing the setup and configuration, but I'll hit those really quick because I can actually show some of it in the live demo. What I want to do is get to some of the considerations. There's a couple blog articles that I've written in the last couple of weeks around some of these considerations. And we'll talk for some of my automation friends and API friends a little bit about the options around how you can use some of the vCloud APIs plus the new API extensions for disaster recovery. So what is vCloud Hybrid Service Disaster Recovery intended to be? Well, it's really based on vSphere replication, so that's the underlying replication technology, which most people figure out. We come right out and say it when we say 15 minutes to 24-hour RPO. By doing it as a service, it's allowing customers to get warm standby capacity on vCHS and replicate their VMs to vCHS. So instead of actually replicating vSphere to vSphere, you're actually replicating those placeholders out into our cloud. It's completely self-service, so everything is done by the end user. Once you subscribe to the service, you set everything up, and you can decide when you want to fail over and which ones you want to replicate. We'll talk about the data seeding, which is a little bit unique, and we could touch on the two DR tests per year. That is actually something that's locked down. If you try to initiate a test, you'll get an error message. I can't show you that because they unlocked it for my demo account. It was locked, and I had them unlock it. And the VMs will have a 30-day lease time. So this is we'll talk about why the service is a little different than the original two offerings in a second. So most people who are familiar with vCHS know at this point that we've got a dedicated cloud and a virtual private cloud instance. This is a new service tier. So this DR service tier, indicated by the little lightning bolt with a blue cloud, and you'll see that in the user interface, is what we call disaster recovery enabled. That means it's been deployed with all of the architecture that we'll see in a few slides to support vSphere replication on the provider end of things. So it's got all the correct API extensions, it's got vSphere replication and deployed, it's got all of the functionality needed for replication to work. It looks very similar to our virtual private cloud instance where we have 10 gigahertz of CPU, 20 gigs of RAM. The initial starting point is 1 terabyte of storage, and then we give you your same 2 public IPs, and we've got this add-on for two tests per year. So subscription-wise, it works like everything else. It is subscription-based, so it's 1 month, 12-month, 24-month, 36-month subscriptions. To be perfectly clear, you do not have to have one of the 2 original services to be a DR customer. You can have dedicated cloud, you can have virtual private cloud, or you can have disaster recovery. You could also have all 3. When I log into my account, you'll actually see that I have all 3 offerings. So there's been some miscommunication, I think, out in the community that in order to have DR, you have to have a VPC or a dedicated cloud, and that's not true. You can be just a disaster recovery customer. So there is some add-ons. So you can add on storage and bandwidth. You can add on IP addresses. You can add on what we call Direct Connect, which a lot of folks have seen me talk about, which is our private line connectivity. So you can add Direct Connect for private line replication from on-premise. You can also add Direct Connect to connect to another cloud environment or cross-connect to a cage. You can add additional failover tests. I'll talk about these compute subscriptions a little bit more. So when we talk about a subscription and a one-time, if I go back a slide, you can add on additional subscriptions. So if you know going into it that you're going to need more than 20 gigs of RAM to support the VMs you want to fail over, this adds in multiplying chunks. So you would add another bucket of 10 gigahertz and 20 gigabytes of RAM. So when we size this, we try to size it properly up front to support the failover. However, if you failed over more than you expected, you can do this one-time compute add-on, which would allow the amount of resources you need for that 30-day period only versus the subscription. So subscription add-ons are sort of a permanent safety net, so you know it's there to support it, or you can do the one-time piece. So what makes this really, really interesting from a foundation perspective, one of the reasons I actually do get excited about this offering now is, all of 3 of these things. The fact that it's hybrid aware, it's integrated 100% with vCHS. There's nothing you have to do to make it work. It's completely hardware independent, so it's software-based replication with vSphere replication technology. And out of the box, we don't require any dedicated connection to the cloud. So there are some other solutions out there that I've looked at and played with, and the first requirement is you have to stand up a VPN or some kind of private line circuit for the replication to actually occur. We've actually, and you'll see in the architecture, we've made some modifications to certain parts of the architecture so that we're doing encrypted tunnels and encrypted data transfer out of the box. So the way I've got it set up is it's just sending traffic over internet pipes through an encrypted channel. So it is so simple to get going from a POC perspective because you don't need anything else to make it work. The encapsulation's already there. It is fully integrated with the vSphere web client. I know everybody's cringing right now, right? But it is only part of the web client, so you'll see when we look at the UI, you'll see that there's a replication icon, and we can actually jump from there and start managing all of our outgoing replications and configure all of our VMs that we want to replicate. So I get this question all the time, and I know somebody's going to ask it afterwards, and I put it right there in a slide for everybody to see. Where does disaster recovery with vCHS and Site Recovery Manager play? Well, if you're a partner on the phone or you're a customer on the phone listening to this broadcast, the way to think about this is these are complementary solutions. And what I mean by that is vCHS disaster recovery is not intended to displace an SRM implementation, but what it can do is it can supplement it. So if you look at this simple workflow, if SRM is in scope, and you want a hosted solution, you're going to be looking at some of our partners that do SRM as a service. iLand, Hosting.com, they've actually done some presentations at past VMworld. Or you're going to do it internally, right? You're going to do an internal do-it-yourself where you've got your own on-premise environments and you're doing storage-based replication, or you're going to do coexistence between the two. Where vCloud Hybrid Service Disaster Recovery fits is, especially in an SRM customer, I'm bringing this up because if anybody goes to VMworld this year, hopefully everybody's going, there is a lab for this. There will be a hands-on lab for disaster or VCHS DR. the way we've written the scope of it is, if you actually read the documentation, you can tell yours truly wrote it, because, or part of the story background, because I actually talk about how the customer that's in this hands-on lab has Site Recovery Manager in their main data centers. However, they've got up and down the East Coast some remote offices and branch offices with very small ESX implementations, 2 to 3 hosts with 20 to 30 virtual machines. And those are the ones they want to protect in addition to their primary data centers. So that's just one example. So what vCHS disaster recovery does, it gives them the ability to replicate from a software level perspective out of those robo locations into vCHS, and then network all that together back to their 2 primary data centers, whichever one may or may not be online during that disaster. So think about it like a hurricane coming up the East Coast. They may fail over from Florida to their other primary site, and then all of their DR stuff is in vCHS in Texas, and it can communicate with all the failed over main infrastructure. The main thing
Sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
To interrupt, but we do have a question on Twitter. There was a question about the subscription as to why would I subscribe to more resources if I could just do the one-time bump up during a disaster?
Great question. There's time involved in doing that, right? So if you're within your RTOs to be able to do that, so what I mean by that is by the time you submit an order, the order through distribution takes time through your partner, right? It gets to vCHS. We have to procure the additional resources. We have to spin those up. We internally have a 4-hour RTO. I don't want to say RTO. We have a 4-hour SLA against provisioning those add-on resources, that one-time add-on resources, from the time we get the order. So we'll do the provisioning of those resources within 4 hours from the time we get it. But if it takes you 7 hours to process that order through your internal systems, you could miss your RTO, right? So it's a great question. The adding on ahead of time and sizing it properly at the beginning is like buying the right amount of life insurance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Definitely
okay.
Take into account your RTO and RPO.
Yeah, bingo. So it all comes down to what your RTO wants to be. Just understand, we will provision the resources within 4 hours of receiving the order. So if distribution or your partner or however you're processing the order takes longer, we have no control over that. Good question, though. The one last thing I want to point out on the SRM piece, so that everybody's clear, this is not an endpoint for Site Recovery Manager, right? So Site Recovery Manager and vCHS DR, they don't play together. They don't talk to each other. So we're actually positioning these as complementary to each other. SRM's not really going away. Customers have it. They love it. This is really targeted at a smaller type of workload. And we'll get into the scalability in a couple of slides, and you'll see why. All right, so let's talk about the architecture a little bit. This is the fun stuff. So again, this is just to reiterate that it is a third type of offering. So you can have just DR, you can have the other two, you can have a combination. What's happening is most people who are familiar with vSphere replication know that we're actually replicating at the block level. We're replicating at the VMDK level. So we're basically taking the whole virtual machine, we're shoving it over to vCHS, we're making it a placeholder. It's the same exact VM that it was before you shipped it. So it's got the same IP address underlying and under the covers. It's got all the same host name information, right? It's an exact copy, just being copied over SSL. Either SSL or VPN or Direct Connect connection, which neither of those are required. So how does this all work? This is where I think it actually gets really cool for the techies on the phone, and I fought to keep this slide in here because I think it actually speaks to a lot of the components. So we all know when you're dealing with vCHS DR or when you're dealing with vSphere replication, you've got this disaster recovery appliance. We know you've got your vSphere and all your infrastructure on both sides. So the right-hand side is the provider that we're controlling. The way it's deployed from a vCHS perspective in a shared tenant is you'll notice you've got 2 VRSs. So for every tenant that gets subscribes to the service, they'll get their own vSphere replication server. We've got one vSphere replication manager, and then we've got multiple vSphere replication servers. On premise, you deploy a single appliance, which includes the vSphere replication manager and the vSphere replication server. What happens is there's a one-to-one. So you install the appliance, it connects to your particular VRS. This is where it gets cool. What we actually did is we updated some of the components in the disaster recovery appliance to include a new VRMS component on both sides. we added a new VMRS plugin, which is the management service plugin. And on vCloud Director SP, we actually updated some components within VCDSP for the UI admin and actually the vCHS portal. So when we look at the portal, you'll see that there's a new tab for those enabled data centers so you can see the replication status. Then we actually deployed some new components. This is where really the rubber meets the road. So most people who are familiar with vSphere replication think about this. You have a vCenter A and a vCenter B, and they're networked together somehow. And when we do the replication, the two VRSs, the two vSphere replication servers, are talking directly to each other to transport data. When you're dealing with a cloud provider, we really don't want to expose the VRS to the internet. So what we did is we added a cloud proxy component in VCDSP to handle all of the communication from your on-premise appliance from a configuration perspective and proxy it through vCloud Director to your specific org's VRS, right? It was a really interesting effort by all the engineering teams to make that work, and it actually is what facilitates all this to work on the back end. So your stuff goes to your org and your VRS, and the next person's goes to their org and their VRS. You'll actually see in the screenshots how we do that from an API or UI perspective. So when you do this across sites, you're able to now pick your yellow VMs that you want to replicate, and you can actually send them to your DR VDC, and right next to it you could have a virtual private cloud running regular infrastructure as a service. All of this is front-ended by vCloud Director within vCHS with vSphere and the storage behind it. So you now get a complete picture of being able to have your hybrid data centers, your always-on hybrid infrastructure that I've talked about in the past, where you get your primary data center connected to your VPC for web services or real-time applications. And now you've got this DR VDC that's also in the mix. So let's talk about the scaling for a second. So I said earlier that there's a particular target market, and you'll see that it's the limitation of vSphere replication per appliance. This is actually a VSR limitation. Is 500 virtual machines per appliance, per vSphere replication appliance. So if you have an on-premise data center and you drop in an appliance and connect it to your vCenter server, we can replicate 500 VMs from that vCenter out to the cloud, and on our cloud, you've got a corresponding vSphere replication server that will handle an incoming 500 virtual machines. If you needed more than 500 virtual machines, you actually scale vertically. So you would need another DR VDC cloud with another vSphere replication appliance associated with it to give you 500 more. And then you would need another on-premise appliance attached to another virtual center, to another vSphere instance. So people who've dealt with vSphere replication know that the management server is sort of a one-to-one. You can only have one management server attached to a vSphere vCenter server. And because the appliance on-premise includes the management component and the replication component all in one appliance, it becomes a one-to-one. So as you start to scale, there are some considerations in how many vCenters you would have to have, how many clouds you would have to have. We're definitely looking at how we can scale this differently. At GA at 1.0, this is how we'd have to scale it. So right now, the target customers are right in that 500 or less range, so that they can actually replicate the number of VMs that they need into a single cloud. So the encryption component out of the box is done in flight. So I mentioned you don't need to have a VPN, you don't need to have a private line circuit. We actually do encrypt it from ESX host to the VR appliance. You'll notice that I think in one of the slides I'll talk about how you'll see a new firewall rule get installed onto your ESX hosts for the encryption from ESXi to VR appliance. And then from the VR appliance through the internet, through the cloud proxy, through the host-based replication back to the ESXi server on the other side, that middle section is all going to be SSL encrypted. So it is all full 43 and secure. So from a system requirements perspective, it's pretty simple. You need vSphere 5.1 or above, any flavors of that. You need vCenter 5.1 or above because it has a vSphere web client. And we already mentioned that your replication appliance will be a one-to-one mapping. We point out the version number on the replication appliance because it's different. There's a 5.5 version, which is used for vCenter replication and Site Recovery Manager integration. And then there's this new 5.6 appliance that has those extra components that I pointed out. If you grab the 5.5 appliance, you'll see the screens won't show you the ability to connect to a cloud provider. If you download the 5.6 appliance when you get assigned to the service and you're enabled to download it, you'll actually see the right options to connect to a cloud provider. On the vCHS side, all you need is a DR subscription. That's it. So minimum requirement is just a subscription for DR. So what does this thing look like? I'll go through the screenshots so we can go into the live environment and take hopefully a lot of questions. So the reason we have the screens is because not everybody has access to a demo environment. So basically when you log into vSphere console, web client, we're going to see this vSphere replication tab, which gets inserted at the time you install the appliance. You'll notice that the firewall rules, if you were to inspect your ESX servers, there'll be a new rule on there once it's installed. This is registered per virtual center, and it's all managed through the web client. So what do you need to actually set this thing up and point it to the cloud? Well, the first thing you need to know is which of your clouds is DR enabled. So in my environment, when I log in, I have probably 7 different clouds, 2 DR clouds. There's a lot of stuff. So you've got to identify the one you want by this blue lightning bolt. And when you drill down, every cloud gets its own vCloud directory API URL. This is the only piece of information you need to connect your vSphere replication appliance to the cloud. You'll also know that you have the right cloud because if you drill down into it, you'll see this replication tab, and that wouldn't exist in a normal virtual data center. So once you have your vCloud Directory API and you go back to your vCenter server, you're going to see this button that says Connect to a Cloud Provider to configure replications. It's a 3-step process. It's literally, once you've downloaded the appliance and imported the OVF and given it all the IP credentials and all those other things you need, it's 3 steps to connect it to the cloud that's DR enabled. You basically give it the API URL and the org name. So what I usually do is I copy the whole thing into both fields, and on the first field I strip out everything after the :443, and in the second field it's everything after the org/, so it's the ID number of the org. Your username and password is basically what you use to log into the vCHS environment, and that's it. And once you do that, it will connect to the cloud itself, to vCHS DR instance. Now, you do have to configure, you can configure 2 networks for recovery and test. So this is where we do have a little bit of automation, that when you do a test failover, we'll assign it to the test network, and when you do a full failover, we'll assign it to a recovery network. You do have 9 networks that you can use, so you'll see in my cloud I've actually got 3 networks configured, so when I do a failover, there are some instances where I'll fail it over and use a different network than the recovery network because I might want to attach it to something else, like a public network or a DMZ or something like that. This is just part of the configuration so that you can complete an actual test or a failover. Once that's done, your configuration to the cloud is finished. And all you have to do is start replicating virtual machines. So you can pick and choose the virtual machines you want, and under your replication options, you're going to now pick replicate to a cloud provider. This is a new option. This didn't exist this doesn't exist in the 5.5 version. You can actually choose to replicate to multiple providers. I'll actually show this in the live environment. I've got 2 different destination endpoints configured for a single on-premise appliance. Now, bear in mind what I said before, that single on-premise appliance can still only do a net total of 500 virtual machines. So I could, in theory, split 250 to one and 250 to the other, 400 to one, 100 to the other. Those 2 destination endpoints are good for up to 500 virtual machines, but because we've only got 1 replication appliance, I can pick and choose where I want to send them to. That one thing I want to point out is the destinations have to be or should be configured in the same replication appliance. What I mean by that is because we're doing a proxy type environment, if the destination doesn't know that there's other endpoints coming into it, it could pose some challenges from a replication perspective, a timing perspective, things like that. So right now, we want to try to tell people to keep it a 1-to-1. You know, when we did beta testing and other stuff, there were people like myself and Massimo sharing a destination endpoint on 2 different vCenter instances, his lab and my lab, and we were pointing to the same location. That's not what I'm showing here. What I'm showing here is 1 source environment on premise pointing to 2 different destinations, and that's perfectly acceptable. And you'll see that in the screenshots. Storage policies preset. There's basically 1 type of storage policy. The replication seeds we'll talk about in a second. We do support guest quiescing on, for Microsoft Shadow Copy services, and then you can set your RPO from 15 minutes to 24 hours. What replication seeds are is we do have the ability, if you have a large data set, you have a lot of virtual machines that are very large, we actually can leverage vCloud Connector offline data transfer, where we ship you a NAS appliance, you export all your virtual machines, you shut them down, you export them to the NAS appliance, you power them back up, and you ship us the NAS appliance. So the NAS appliance is now in transit. It gets to our operations team. We will upload those virtual machines into your DR cloud, and that's where you would use this replication seed option. If one of those machines that you're configuring was one you shipped to us, you would pick the replication seed, and you'd be presented with a menu or a list of all the machines that were sitting in the cloud that would be your seed machine. And all you have to do is match the two up, right? If it was if it was server 001 and you see server 001 and 002 that were imported, just make sure you pick server 001. It will cut down the replication time, but it also means that during that time in transit, you were still running the VM, and now we don't have to do a full sync of all the data, because full sync is going to take a varying number of hours depending on your internet connectivity. I can tell you when I did a 50 gig VM from Washington State down to Las Vegas, where one of mine is, it was about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for full sync. Once the replication's in place, you'll be able to monitor it. You could see your status. You could see when it was last synced, whether it was okay, what your RPOs are. And from here, you can actually reconfigure the virtual machine. You can pause it. You can pause replication. You can completely stop replication. You can initiate a full failover, and you can also do a test failover. From an API perspective, the test option, the failover option, and the, I believe, pause option are available through the API, because you can't really configure something in the cloud because the source is vCenter, so there's no API on the cloud side for that. And stopping, you can stop through the UI. I have to see if that one's in the API, but definitely test and failover and pause are. So some considerations around this, and then we'll get to the live screens and then some questions. So these are some of the biggest ones that come up. I've already actually written a fairly lengthy blog post about how to deal with infrastructure. That's actually on the vCloud blog. But you want to consider where Active Directory is going to be running. Is it something you're going to want to replicate, or is it something you're going to want to have running in the cloud already? We'll talk about that. You're going to see a couple of diagrams from the blog post. Networking is always going to be a consideration because vCloud Directory uses static IP pools, so things may get re-IP'd. You may not want them to be re-IP'd. You may have to reconfigure some external DNS, things like that. Storage is pretty basic. Just make sure you purchase enough storage add-ons to cover all the VMs that you're going to replicate. So we don't do thin provisioning, so if you've got over 1 terabyte of disk configured, you need to make sure that you've reserved enough. Also take into account vSwap, because if you don't take that into account when you size it, you just go by the size of the VM and you forget about the size of all the memory added up, you may have some failures in powering on or need to get an add-on because you don't have enough storage to account for vSwap when you power them on. So pilot light VM. So there's 3 ways to deal with Active Directory DNS, always on infrastructure that you want to have running to support these VMs when they fail over. The first way to do it is sort of a no-cost way, which is if you are a customer who, say, has 2 physical data centers. Let's say you've got an East Coast and a West Coast. And for all intents and purposes, you're more concerned about the West Coast data center applications being set up for DR. What you could do is you could buy an East Coast DR option, right? So in Sterling, Virginia, you can replicate all the VMs from the West Coast to the East Coast. Then what you could do is you can actually set up a VPN tunnel from the Sterling, Virginia VPC to your East Coast physical data center and leverage all of the Active Directory infrastructure there and basically assign the networks that you create in the vCHS DR virtual data center in Active Directory sites and services and call them part of the East Coast site. So when those VMs come on, they actually will locate a domain controller or DNS server or things like that. You still may have some basic reconfiguration you have to do, but you don't have to pay for any other infrastructure. And then you could sort of mirror that in the opposite direction if you wanted to. The other way to do it is if you're actually got infrastructure in a cage that's in the same data center as ours. So again, maybe you've already purchased a co-location cage within the same Virginia data center or in Switch in Las Vegas. You can actually get our cross-connect functionality, and we can cross-connect directly into that cage where I'm going to guess there's probably some Active Directory DNS or supporting infrastructure that you can leverage. And that's probably syncing back to on-premise anyway. So That's the second option. The third option, if all else fails and you don't have a cage and you're one data center shop, the fallback that I've been positioning to people is go get a virtual private cloud. Get a small VPC within vCHS and run that supporting infrastructure there. VPN that back to your headquarters to keep everything in sync from an AD perspective. And then what we do is a cloud-to-cloud VPN. So your recovery as a service cloud and your virtual private cloud could be in the same data center. They could both be in Sterling. One could be in Sterling, one could be in Texas. The cloud-to-cloud VPN doesn't really care at that point. But it's just sort of the third option for people to think about on how to get some of these things connected up. So let's talk a little bit about automation, because this one definitely always comes up. Out of the box, the only automation we have is basically setting the network at the time of failover. Power on operations, configuration operations, IP changes. Those are things that are going to be part of a manual runbook. So you can use whatever tools you want. It's REST API based, so whether it's VCO, VCAC, Puppet, Chef, third-party stuff, doesn't matter. The things you can automate are things you want to look at are managing certain VM changes. Like, do you want to change the network? Maybe you want to use a different network than the recovery network that was assigned, because there's only one, quote-unquote, one recovery network. How are you going to handle IP changes, DNS changes, things like that? Like anything else, build a manual runbook first, and then start leveraging variations of the different APIs. And so, for example, there's a couple steps I'll show you in a basic workflow where some of the APIs might be the recovery as a service extensions, and some of the API calls might be straight vCloud APIs, or some may be vCHS extensions, but they're all bundled as part of the vCloud APIs within vCHS. And then we're only going to have out-of-the-box basic automation for failover and testing. So a couple of quick examples. So if we were to look at a workflow, basic workflow for setup and configuration, attaching to the disaster recovery site and configuring the networks, configuring replication, and in the initial sync, those are all things that have to be done manually. You'll notice the stuff, I should put a note in this slide. The things that have an asterisk are potential automation points because they have an API that you could use. So vSphere replication service, or vSphere replication server, doesn't actually have an API. The appliance itself doesn't have an API. So there's no way to automate that attachment to the recovery site, those fields that I showed you, or configuring the networks, or actually configuring replication right now. The test failover, you can initiate a test failover through the vCHS DR extensions, and you can initiate a full failover. So if you think about this, that step you can do. So once you've initiated that, you can then start to look at other things that you can automate, like changing the IP address, changing the network. From a failback perspective, I put this in here specifically because we do have a failback process. It involves using vCloud connector in order to fail something back, or not just failing it back to on-premise. When you do the hands-on lab, we're actually going to be failing it over to a virtual private cloud. We're going to basically, the way the script is written is that it's been running in DR for 30 days, and it's been running very well in the cloud, and the customer decided that even though the site's back online, they're just going to move it to a permanent vCHS location, permanent offering. So first thing you would do is power off the VM, right? You can do that through the vCloud APIs. If you were bringing it back on premise, you would actually have to delete the original VM in the vSphere inventory, because you're probably going to bring it back with the same name, and we all know you can't have two VMs in the inventory database with the same name. So you can either rename it or delete it, depending on how long it's been running. Once you've done that, you kick off a vCloud connector copy from vCHS to vSphere. And you'll notice that's not an automated process, because VCC, as most people know, doesn't have an API. Once it's back on premise, you will have to do some reconfiguration, because it's not going to have a port group attached, right? Because when it comes back over to vSphere, it's going to think it was connected to a network that was in vCHS. So you're going to have to reassign the original port group. That's generally something you can do through vSphere APIs. Then you're going to power it on, and you're going to restart the replication, which back over here, configuring replication you can't do through an API. So the whole point of this is to say that there are some automation capabilities. Massimo actually posted today in the internal social cast that he actually did do a complete failover through the APIs. He hasn't divulged to me what tools he used yet, but he has actually done it through the APIs. Chris, your friend Chris here, doesn't do APIs, so I do everything manually. So before we get to questions, what I want to do is actually show some of this so you'll actually get a feel for it. And some of this stuff we'll actually be doing, I don't think we're going to be doing it specifically in the booth at EMC World, but a lot of this will be part of the lab, the hands-on lab specifically. So there's two things I want to point out. There is the blog articles on vcloud.vmware.com about the supporting infrastructure. I wrote a personal blog article around some considerations, which I didn't put on the vCloud blog because it was more my opinions than sort of any official VMware notes. And if you go to vcloud.vmware.com/tutorials, you'll see some recorded videos of this in action, which is what the hands-on lab is based on. And a new video just went on YouTube today. I think I tweeted that out, where I actually show a failover of a live application, live web server running with a public IP address on-premise in vSphere, failing it over, updating the IP address and updating external DNS, and making sure the web server is back online with a whole new IP address in the cloud. I like to do my demos where my recordings where it's not just a bunch of flashing lights, we actually see something really actually happen real time. So here's your vSphere replication tab where we can go in and we can actually see that it's already configured. And if I actually go to my monitor tab, you'll see I've got some things replicating. I should have about I've got 3 outgoing replications. So I've got this WordPress server, which is the one you'll see in that demo that I posted on YouTube today. And then I've got just 2 demo ones so that I can mess around with it. I kind of do the Betty Crocker approach, right? So I've got these 2 for a reason, because what I'm going to do with you is I'm actually going to show you, the replication screens real time, and we'll kick one off. So I've got this. This is kind of like you make the dinner and then you put it in the oven, and there's a second one in the second oven below it. You're doing a cooking show. So that's why I call it the Betty Crocker approach. So if I go into this one here that isn't actually configured for replication, I'm just going to step really quickly through those same screens because it's a little different than seeing it in a screenshot. Plus, you can see here I've actually got 2 destinations. This one here is in Texas, and this one here is in the UK. So what I'm actually going to do is we're going to send this one across the pond. Why not? The authentication you do usually once per session. If you're doing a lot of replications, you don't have to re-authenticate multiple times. It'll stay connected before it times out, so there is a built-in timeout on the authentication. And once this actually comes up, it'll present us with our available virtual data centers that we can actually replicate to. It's always going to be a one-to-one, so your target site is only going to include 1 target virtual data center. That's always the fun part about a live demo. Make sure it actually connects across the pond. It should. If it doesn't, I'll use the US one. We'll go from there. Or I put in my credentials wrong. One thing I'll pull up while that's actually connecting is let me go into the vCHS UI so I can show you the ones that are already replicated out to the cloud. You can see that new tab. So for anybody who's never seen the vCHS UI, this is what it looks like when you have a whole bunch of clouds in your tenant. I've got a UK cloud, a Texas cloud, I've got 3 clouds in Las Vegas and 1 in Virginia. So I've logged in one time and I see everything that I have access to. So let's look at the Texas one because that's a DR cloud. And you can see here it is identified by that blue lightning bolt. But you can see I can go to this replication tab and I can see from this UI that both of those demos are replicating correctly. I get their transfer sizes, what their RPOs are set for, how long their last transfer duration was, all of the same information I actually get in the vSphere web client. So now that this is actually connected, I can pick my storage. I'm not going to do any guest quiescing on this, and I'll set this to 4 hours, and I'll just hit finish. And that's it. That virtual machine is now going to start replicating. I can't think of a solution that's easier to start moving data from a virtual machine in vSphere out to a cloud provider for DR, other than a few clicks. So what will happen is this will kick off a replication, it'll create a placeholder, all of that happens through the API, and then it'll start to look like these where we'll see it and we can monitor its initial sync. What we can then do is on some of these, we can also do our test failovers and we can do full failovers if we wanted to. Those we can initiate from either the vSphere web client or the UI or the API. So if I go here, I can actually remove replication on these, or if I actually drill into the virtual machine list, I can actually test it, or I can do a recovery. and you can see that it'll tell you if replication's in progress. You get a lot of information about it, and you'll notice in that first screen it just says it's a placeholder, or when this recovery status is no longer in progress, it'll show as a placeholder. When you do a test, it'll become a live virtual machine, and when you do a full failover, it'll become a live virtual machine. Those I actually do on these very same VMs that you see here, these demo 1, 2, and 3s. Those are what you'll see in the video. This is the exact same lab that I used in those the 8-part video series. Once you've gotten those moved over, you can look at what you want to set up for your networks. So you can see here I've got 3 different networks in Texas that are configured. This is the one of these is the test one, and one of these is configured as the recovery network. So actually, let's just go take a look at the settings of each of those sites, because you can actually edit the sites and their connections if you wanted to. So we can see here the target sites. So I've got my 2 target sites, and if I wanted to add a new one, you'd be able to see those screens where you would actually connect to the new target site. But we can also edit these and look at the settings of the networks that are configured. So my lab is a little bit slow tonight, although I am connected to Boston and then connecting to Wenatchee. So Lord only knows. Once you actually have all this stuff set up, you basically pre-configure your networks first, right? So you're not going to start any replications. You're not going to configure it so you've established how many networks you want in the cloud. So we could see here, this one I'm already connected to. So I could reconnect the sites, I could disconnect it, or I could configure my target networks. And you can see I could go in here at any time and change the recovery network or the test network. If you do that, it's only going to affect new replications. Any ones that are already being replicated will already have been configured with the previous settings. That's just something to bear in mind. I think there's actually a dialog box that'll come up. Probably shouldn't have picked the UK one because it's taken so long. So you can see the UK one only has a default routed and a default isolated, so those are the only 2 I can really choose from. If I go to Texas and I configure the target networks and I authenticate, because I haven't authenticated to Texas yet, we'll actually see that we can choose from all 3 of them. I've actually created those networks specifically ahead of time. I needed to do that for the demo video that I recorded and posted today. So you can see these don't even have the default networks. This has all been custom configured with a corporate, a test, and a public. And I can use any one of those 3 if I wanted to. So if we did want to kick off a test, which we can certainly do because that doesn't take too long, we won't really do the full power on sequence, but we can actually go look at our VMs that are replicating, and all it really is highlighting the VM we want to actually do the failover on or do the test on, and we're just going to kick off a test recovery. And what we'll see is we'll just use the latest data available, and we won't power on the virtual machine. So we'll just hit finish. That will start the test process kicking over. And basically all the test process is, if we had said use new data, it would do a sync first. And then the second step would be converting the virtual machine from a placeholder to a manageable virtual machine that we can edit settings on, power on, use a remote console, do all the normal things that we would do with a real virtual machine. When the test is done, you can do the test cleanup. So in the background, it's always replicating new changes to the original VM. But you're able to actually run a full test cleanup and get rid of all the replica data and everything after your test is complete. I'm only able to do this because that tenant was enabled for basically an unlimited number of tests for video purposes and other things. I'm not sure if the other one was, but if it's not, you'll actually get an error that says this is not available for test purposes. Call your cloud administrator. Basically, to do a test, you have to call GSS first to schedule it. They'll enable the test function, and then you can run your test. And part of the reason we do that is they want to make sure that they're on the line, they're ready to go, they're there to help with the testing process throughout. And if something goes wrong or you need help with configuration, there's basically already an open ticket for it. So that's one of the major reasons we wanted to do it. So we got about, I don't know, 10 or 12 minutes left. So I've seen my phone. I've been diligently not looking at my phone at the tweets, so I don't know what questions are out there.
Not too many questions so far. Just more general comments.
Comments, great. What are the comments? I saw one that said, "Do I work out as fast as I talk?" Apparently, I haven't gotten into the southern mode yet, but I have a lot of content. I wanted to get you guys really good stuff. So,
no, this has really been great.
Yeah. Does he work out at the same pace? Does he? I think Colotti does his vBrownBag. Yeah, probably. Let's see. Is there other questions? Did you want to open up the phones for questions?
All right, let's see. There's no questions in the Q&A. Oh, actually, no. We have. Oh, there's a question from Eric Bachman. Does vCHS disaster recovery do any dedupe?
No. Right now, we're not doing any dedupes or thin provisioning, so it's going to use whatever space on storage. That's why I said the storage allotment that you choose at the time you purchase. Most people are probably doing add-ons for storage before anything else, just to make sure they have enough.
Okay, and the questions are starting to come in now. Here's another one from Michael Simcoe. How does vCHS disaster recovery compare to similar offerings from places like BlueLock?
Specifically to BlueLock, I'm not sure. I should probably talk to my friends over there and find out what their actual offering is. I've been so head in the sand, basically doing the release documentation for this. I haven't been able to look at that stuff. The only one that I actually poked at a little bit because I was getting asked about was, which one was it? Hotlink DR Express. And I didn't get a chance to play with it because I couldn't get the bits, but I watched a couple videos on it. So I don't really have a ton of comments around what other competitors have right now. I was just curious because people were asking me how it compared to that. So I can't give you an educated answer. I would love to if any of my buddies from BlueLock are at EMC World next week. We can compare notes.
Sure. So everybody, make sure you go to EMC World so you can get the answer. The next question: can you get a trial with vCloud hybrid service similar to other vSphere products offering a 60-day trial, maybe a capacity trial, like some amount of gigabytes or something like that?
Yeah, it's a pretty popular question for anything vCHS. Unfortunately, no. The answer today is we don't have a trial account. That's actually one of the big reasons where right after GA we went to a 1-month SKU, because the original at release, the virtual private cloud was a minimum 3-month and the dedicated was a minimum 12-month. So to alleviate that in the community a little bit, that's where you see now the 1-month offering. So it's not a free; it's a pay to play, but it's something that we're constantly obviously looking at. We get that question a lot, so we're getting there, right? We came out of GA with 3 months and a year, and within a couple of months after we already dropped it to a month. So we've been sitting with that for a little while.
Okay, and one last question from Twitter. How long till vCloud hybrid service is ready for FedRAMP, especially disaster recovery for the federal government space?
That's also a great question. I've been taking that back a couple times because it's not right now, because it is being run in the same data centers that the regular vCHS environments are. There has been some stuff that we've been working on from a government perspective. I haven't gotten the details on how the DR offering specifically in architecture is going to feed into that. The first step was getting it into the regular data centers first. Our primary focus is always getting the offerings into all of the U.S. data centers. And the fact that this actually GA'd in the UK data center at the day it came out, which when the UK data center was only about a month GA, was a big accomplishment for us. So our goal is always the primary data centers first, that all the offerings are available in all data centers, and then because we're still working on the whole FedRAMP government aspect for the cloud, then these things will feed in. So I wish I had that answer. I do. I hate it when you guys ask me questions that I just can't answer. It bugs me. 'Cause I wish I could. Okay. I wish I could answer all of them. I don't have all the details.
All right. And same question for sure. It might be a similar answer for financial verticals, i.e., high tier, PCI compliance, FRC, and all the other acronyms.
That's actually easier, right? So those certifications, those certifications we are doing within the existing data centers. The whole, what I've been told, now I'm not a federal guy, I'm sure some of the federal guys will come kill me afterwards. But it's very different worlds, right? PCI compliant versus FedRAMP compliancy, like apples and oranges. So we've gone through HIPAA compliancy. There's actually a white paper on vCHS and HIPAA. I think there might be a white paper on PCI. If not, no, I don't think it's out yet because we're still in the middle of doing it. But we're actually in those cycles, right? So the PCI compliancy, financial auditing, those compliancies we're actually working through fairly quickly in the existing data centers, in the data centers where DR is offered. So stay tuned and just watch for the announcements on those as they get completed.
Okay, and one more question about the actual technology. Can you go back over the necessary vSphere, vSwitch requirements for the deployment?
Yep, let me just go back to, actually from a vSphere perspective, all that's required is, let me bring up the minimum versions because that's probably the system requirements is probably the most prevalent. So vSphere 5.1, vCenter 5.1, right? If that's all you remember, we're winning. The appliance piece, you can't actually download the 5.6 appliance until you've been entitled to the service, so you can't really make the mistake by getting the wrong appliance. That's it. So that's why I say from an implementation perspective, it doesn't matter what your vSwitches look like, it doesn't matter what your VXLAN looks like. We don't care because all we're doing is picking up the VM data and copying it through the vCenter to the vSphere replication appliance. So all you have to do is get the 5.6 appliance, download it, import the OVF, configure it with an IP address into a 5.1 environment on premise, and you're done. Like you're done with the deployment on premise. So people are probably asking because it sounds so simple, but it actually was. I mean, when I did this in beta, I was like, that's it? Like it's working? Cool.
All right. So Chris, did you have any more that you want to show, or do you want to go ahead? Actually, we have someone volunteering to put their hand up and talk on the line. If you're ready for that.
Yeah, sure. Depends on who it is. Who is it?
John White. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you.
Oh, I know the name.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and unmute
Sure,
John.
Yeah. And actually, I'm just going to, if you look at this screen here, if everybody's on the WebEx, you can see now that one says test ready. So you can see the status changed, and we could then actually do our cleanup. So I did the initial test deployment from vCenter. I can now actually initiate the cleanup from the vCHS UI. So you can do it from both sides.
Okay, nice. John, you are unmuted.
Great. I was just wondering if you can comment on the storage requirements for the replication appliance that's on-premise. How long is it holding on to the data? Do I basically need to, like double the data requirements or the storage requirements for that to support that replication appliance, or is it, holding on to, tiny bits at a time and then replicating out?
And what I've been seeing, it's tiny bits, but just to answer your question, I haven't actually looked at the deployment of that appliance, but let's actually take a look at how it's actually deployed, because come to think of it, I don't think I ever have actually seen how big the disks are on it. Yes, I know. I don't think it's that large. Yeah, it's got a 10 gigabyte hard disk, right? So I haven't had to change that, and I've been replicating 50 to 100 gigs of data. So it is a streaming. vSphere replication really does do a streaming type of copy, unlike vCloud Connector. So those of us who know vCloud Connector, it's got the transfer space, and sometimes you have to increase the disk size. This is a very small footprint, which is kind of cool, right? I mean, a 12 gig VM to do all the replication for 500 VMs, not a whole lot of disk space.
Got it. Thank you.
I'm glad you made me look, because I never actually looked at it. Actually, somebody asked for the hands-on labs. I'm like, I don't know how big it is. We can just look in the lab. Any other phone questions, Twitter questions? Everybody asleep?
Oh, sorry about that. I'm on mute. How about that?
You're just talking to yourself. Huh?
Yeah, I have a question about the replication appliance. Can you protect it with HA? What's the best practice around that?
That's an interesting question. I haven't played with that yet. I don't believe we can use HA. Let's go back to the settings. I think it had more than one vCPU. And because it's a Yeah, it's got 2 vCPUs, so we can't use HA to protect it. Wow. Okay, somebody just stumped the chump. I will have to bring that back to engineering.
Wait, fault tolerance, probably not, but HA should be okay, maybe?
Oh, yeah. So you were talking about FT. So FT, no. Yeah, it's part of, in this cluster, it's part of a regular HA. You know, this is a 4-server cluster. So, yeah, it's HA enabled from that perspective. I apologize, I was looking from an FT perspective. So the way it actually works is because there's no persistent data, now that I actually think about it out loud, if an HA event occurred, remember your lowest RPO is 15 minutes. So it should be back online before a replication starts, and even if it isn't, those replications will probably show out of sync or that they missed an RPO deadline for that period, for that time period, but then when the next one kicks off, they should catch up, right? So because there's no persistent data, if it fails in the middle of a replication and comes back on, it should actually pick up from the last known point. It'll probably just fail that particular replication and start on the next one. That's actually something I could test, but my replications go so fast because the data change rate on my test VMs is so small. Like they replicate in like 30 seconds for changes. So.
Okay, and we're coming up to the top of time. I want to make sure that we get in this last question. Does the appliance has 2 CPUs and 4 CPU options? Are there any details on sizing recommendations?
Not sure I understand the question.
Okay, let me see if Ryan wants to go ahead and voice it. He might be able to describe it better than me. Ryan
so it has
I'll
2 CPUs and 4 gigs of memory. He's
No,
probably going off of
a 2 CPU and 4 CPU option when you're deploying the appliance. So
this one actually did not. The 5.6 one didn't. I don't recall it actually giving me the option with 5.6. So that might have been something we hard coded in the 5.6 version versus the 5.5 version. I actually don't remember seeing it, but to my own detriment, I probably clicked next so fast I might not have seen it. So I can go get the appliance again, the 5.6 appliance, and actually just download it and run through it slower. But I really don't remember the 5.6 version actually asking for sizing. It was just out of the box configured. But I'll double check.
Okay, and Ryan doesn't have a microphone, but he did see the option with the 5.6 one, so maybe he did accept the defaults.
Yeah, so I'll have to go back. Was that during the beta, or was that the GA appliance? Because we might have done it in the beta.
Ryan, give us the answer. Did you use the beta or the GA appliance? Let's see. GA, he did the install today.
Oh, all right. Well, I'll have to go back. You're right. I do a lot of things fast, apparently. I talk fast, I work out fast, and I click next too fast. Let me go back. If you actually, I'll do it again, and I'll grab a screenshot. I'm wondering if there's something in the screen that says to support the full 500. I might have read it and only said that I was going to be replicating a few VMs, so I don't remember what the option gave. But Ryan, ping me on Twitter. Let's if you have a screenshot of it, let's talk offline, and I'll go ping the engineers and find out what difference it makes.
Okay, Chris, I know we're over time, but can you take 2 more questions from Jonathan Copeland?
Sure.
Okay, these are the last 2 questions, guys. After that, follow up on Twitter. But the first one is, with just pure vCHS and not disaster recovery, you could just completely bypass on-prem if you wanted to, right? So I take it have vSphere all in the cloud.
No. So that's come up a bunch of times. You can run a vCenter in your vCHS, but you can't run any nested ESX servers. There's no way to support that in a shared cloud from a promiscuous mode networking. There's a whole mess of things that we just don't support in the cloud. So you don't have access to the underlying vCenter that's running the cloud. So you could run a stack, but it's a very limited stack, and it's fairly unsupported by doing that.
Okay, and then the follow-up question probably is automatically answered by that, but could you do DR from one vCHS data center to another vCHS data center, you know, that whole protection of your cloud infrastructure?
Yeah, not with this particular offering. It would actually, what that's referred to internally is cloud-to-cloud DR, just kind of like we call it cloud-to-cloud VPN. So that's actually a different effort that folks are looking at as an option. So it's not something I can speak to when it's going to happen or where or how or if, but it's definitely come up as a conversation. It it I can't tell you if it would be solved by this, but this, the way it's deployed, you couldn't do that. This is specifically on-premise vSphere access because it's plugged into vSphere to the cloud. So great question. We do get that, and we've actually pushed that back in the beta as something that customers would want to do for sure. So if you had a vCHS in Texas and a vCHS in Sterling, and they were both running infrastructures